Hi, boys and girls. Welcome to today's lesson from Michaela DePrince, the war orphan who became a ballerina, written by William Kremer. This is a magazine article and it is a nonfiction piece of text. Today we're going to be talking about conventions of writing, more specifically reflexive and intensive pronouns. First, I would like you to get your My Perspectives books out and open to page 58. This is what the page should look like. So on this page, we're going to talk about these two different types of pronouns. Let's review first what a pronoun is. A pronoun is a word that takes the place of one or more nouns or other pronouns, such as he, she, it, they, we. Now, reflexive and intensive pronouns are forms of pronouns that end with the word self or selves. And these pronoun forms look the same, but they function very differently. So a first person pronoun of my in a singular form would be myself, plural would be ourselves. Second would be yourself and yourselves. Third person would be he, him, his. So the singular for an reflexive or intensive pronoun would be himself, herself, itself, or if it's plural, would be themselves. Now, a reflexive pronoun reflects or directs the action of a verb back on its subject, and it indicates that the person or thing performing the action of the verb is also receiving the action. A reflexive pronoun is essential to the meaning of the sentence. So let's look down at the bottom at the examples of reflexive pronouns. I bought myself a new paintbrush. So myself reflects back on I. Luke made himself late for school. So himself reflects back to Luke. Emil and Maria were mad at themselves for losing the cat. Themselves reflects back to Emil and Maria. Now, if you took out those reflexive pronouns, the sentence would not make sense. I bought a new paintbrush. Luke made late for school. Emil and Maria were mad at for losing the cat. So although in the first one, I bought myself a new paintbrush, it made sense when I took myself out. But when we look at Luke made himself late for school, if I take that reflexive pronoun out, Luke made late for school, you need that word there for the meaning of the sentence. Now let's look at our intensive pronouns. These simply emphasize the noun or pronoun to which it refers. It usually appears very close to or right next to the noun that it is emphasizing. And an intensive pronoun can be removed from a sentence without changing its meaning. So in the chart below, the subject is underlined and the pronoun is set in the italics print. So let's look at the example of our intensive pronouns. I myself chose the paintbrush I wanted. Luke himself should have known better. Luke should have known better. Makes sense without the word himself. I chose the paintbrush I wanted. It still makes complete sense without myself. And then our last example is Emil and Maria themselves searched for the lost cat. If I take themselves out, the sentence is not changing any meaning. Emil and Maria searched for the lost cat. And also I want to point out that in the intensive pronouns, they're located right next to the nouns that they're reflecting back to. So reflexive and intensive pronouns, again, the first person, myself, that's singular. Ourselves would be plural. Second person is you, your. So yourself is a singular. Yourselves is plural. Third person, himself, herself, itself. But then as a plural, it's themselves. So reflexive pronouns. A reflexive pronoun changes the meaning of the sentence. Without the pronoun, the sentence does not make sense or the meaning has changed. For example, Michael taught himself to play the piano. Himself refers back to Michael. Now, if I take himself out, it's not going to make sense. Michael taught to play the piano. You're left with the question, who did Michael teach to play the piano? So let's look at an intensive pronoun. First, intensive pronouns add to or intensify its antecedent or the noun that comes before it. Intensive pronouns do not change the meaning of the sentence when they're taken out. Let's look at an example of that. Michael Jackson himself taught the child to play the piano. So the emphasis goes on himself to Michael Jackson, really putting that intensity of the word and phrase back on Michael Jackson. Now, if I take himself out, the sentence should still make sense. Michael Jackson taught the child to play the piano. Taking himself out, that intensive pronoun, doesn't change anything. So let's look at a couple examples. The mayor himself cut the ribbon at the building dedication. Is himself intensive or reflexive? And the biggest question you should ask yourself is, if I take himself out, does the sentence still make sense? So let's try that. The mayor cut the ribbon at the building dedication. It still makes sense. So that means it's an intensive pronoun. Let's look at another example. Jennifer accidentally cut herself on the broken glass. Okay, so let's take herself out. Jennifer accidentally cut on the broken glass. Doesn't sound quite right if I take it out. So therefore, it is a reflexive pronoun. I need herself in there for the sentence to make sense. Another example. The team pushed themselves to the limit. So let's try taking out themselves to see if it makes sense. The team pushed to the limit. The meaning is changed in this sentence now. What have they pushed to the limit? So because the meaning is changed and it doesn't quite make sense, this is a reflexive pronoun. We need that pronoun in there. Final example. Ramon cleared the room by himself. Ramon cleaned the room by. If I take it out, it doesn't quite make sense, does it? But if I take the word by out, it does make sense. So Ramon cleaned the room. We don't need to by himself. It still makes sense. So it's an intensive pronoun. Now, if you look at number 1, the intensive pronoun is located right next to the noun that it's intensifying. But in 2 and 3, where we have reflexive, the pronoun is not right next to the noun that it's intensifying. So that is one of the examples that they do give us to look at. Though in number 4, this is intensive and himself is all the way at the end of the sentence. So you're going to have 2 worksheets or a worksheet to do working on reflexive and intensive pronouns. So let's just look at this worksheet real quick. The top of the worksheet always gives us the definition and examples of the reflexive and intensive pronouns. So in part A, you're going to underline the reflexive pronoun. And then you're going to circle or highlight the word to which the reflexive pronoun refers. So remember, reflexive means if we take it out, the sentence isn't going to make sense. So let's look at number 1. I bought myself a new pair of shoes. So the reflexive pronoun is myself. So I would underline that. And then the noun or subject that myself is referring to is I. So I'm going to highlight that because it's easier to highlight than circle. And then you're going to go through the next 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the same manner. Underline the reflexive pronoun and highlight the word that it is referring to. In part B, you're going to look at each of the 5 sentences, and on the line you're going to write are or reflexive if the sentence contains a reflexive pronoun, or I or intensive if the sentence contains an intensive pronoun. So let's do number 1 together. They themselves could not remember the dance routine. So remember back a couple slides, we talked about let's read the sentence without that pronoun in it to see if it still makes sense. That should help guide us to either intensive or reflexive. So our pronoun is themselves. So let's take it out when we're reading. They could not remember the dance routine. The meaning of the sentence doesn't change. I can take it out and the sentence still makes sense. And the second thing was that a lot of times the intensive pronouns are located right next to the word, pronoun, or noun that they're intensifying, which in this case it is. So this is indeed an intensive pronoun. So again, you can write either I or intensive on the line. And you're going to do the same thing for questions 2, 3, 4, and 5. When you are done, go back to the assignment and be sure to submit it through our Google Classroom.